This is a production of Cornell University.
Pleasure to be here. Thanks for the invitation. Nice to see some familiar faces. Happy to talk about my work. I usually spend most of my time doing it and not much time talking about summarizing it. So this was a really good exercise for me and sort of tying some things together to give people who have absolutely no idea what I've been doing for the last 20 years a snapshot of one particular area of my work. As Tony said, and I'm very proud to say, I almost feel I've been around long enough to say I'm one of those old-fashioned extension scientists. I really believe very strongly in my commitment as an extension specialist, and you're going to see that in my work. I've had the pleasure, of course, you can't avoid being involved in basic research at some level at this place, and I've always had the pleasure of being involved in that. But what I'm going to talk to you today about is this intersection of systems-based research done at the landscape level and changing people's behaviors and using data to drive your education programs and then further continue to hone the research and education ideas that you implement. This is the environment that I work in, what we now know as the urban ecosystem. We've got really nice terms for that type of landscape now. This is the particular landscape that I will be talking about today, one of the many that we work on. As Tony said, I've had the pleasure of working with the practitioners at Central Park, and a lot of the interest that I initially get is, we have a problem, how can you help us? And then laws get passed that says, well, you can't use those things anymore. You can't have those pesticides anymore. And so then not only do you become, as I am, an extension scientist where you sort of help them solve short-term issues, they begin to see the long-term challenges they're going to face as the people who think much of this is their front yard. And most of these people have a fair amount of affluence to draw upon, affluence and influence to draw upon to impact the way this particular landscape gets managed. So I spend a lot of time on the intersection of managing plants in urban environments, and as Jenny Gown-Niffen said in her presentation in our department meeting this morning, the sort of socioeconomic intersection and understanding how much people are involved in the decisions and the way things get managed out in these landscapes. And one of the driving forces, believe it or not, in the urban landscape is mimicry. There's a fair amount of research that's been conducted now to say, well, if they see that's the way the landscape's going to be, that's what everybody wants. We know it in sort of common vernacular as keeping up with the Joneses, right? I think we've observed this for a long time, and one of the problems is once one person does it badly, then you've got it multiplied and I'll show you a pretty large scale. The other thing that's important to understand about the urban environment, particularly from a stormwater perspective, where I really spend a lot of my time thinking about reducing inputs because of these reasons, is 80% of the US population lives on about 10% of the land, and the urban environments have put exceptional pressure on the ecosystems that service them that most of the time are not in cities. Bringing the urban green infrastructure into the city now begins to connect this population with an ecosystem that can service them for their needs. But oftentimes they put a disproportionate pressure on those ecosystems that are very much dispersed from where they are. So lots of interest in the urban landscape, rebuilding it, building more, and of course all the roles that the stormwater management system impacts. This grass is involved in it. We cover a fair amount of the landscape. This is from a 2005 NASA publication by Malesi and others, where they did some spectral scans of the United States to look at where grass was, and by no surprise, grass is where the people are. You don't see a lot of grass out here that people are managing as turf. There's a lot of grass out here, I assure you, I've seen it. But most of what we call managed turf is managed in these urban environments, and that happens to be in close proximity where we pave a lot of places, right? You all of a sudden now eliminate a big component of stormwater management, in fact make a lot of problems worse because where people are, there's also going to be significant amounts of impervious surface. So anything that potentially goes onto that landscape, if it is allowed to escape into those impervious surfaces, then gets channeled and funneled and concentrated into some of the other issues that this wonderful picture I saw on Twitter the other day, I couldn't help myself but steal it. The connectedness of the watersheds and the rivers that connect our American continental United States society. And when you start looking up in here, I actually wouldn't be surprised if at some point we start to see laws drawn along the lines of these watersheds as they do throughout Europe. So these kinds of this connective tissue in the water system is what I connect myself to in the urban environment. So now that's ultimately going to be impacted by the inputs that we bring into this urban environment. And what do people use in urban environments? Well, to the tune of about $5.5 billion they spend on lawn and garden products. This is an enormously large economic driver in the green industry. And if you look just at pesticides and fertilizers that could potentially have nutrient and other health effects, you're looking at in excess of 50% of all the money is spent on stuff that gets put on that landscape, that even if we did sort of crude percentage losses in the 0.0001 percentage points, you're still looking at enormous amounts of materials that can concentrate and get into the water. And of course, when you look at pesticide use specifically, New York State's been keeping records for a number of years. And when you look at the pounds of pesticides by county, which is the way the DEC has been collecting them for many years, you see that some of the largest pesticide use gets associated in the urban areas, right? Buffalo, Rochester, Syracuse, up the Hudson Valley into Albany. So lots of pesticide use in urban areas, and lots of rural areas, not as much, right? Even though we know there's a lot of agricultural production going on there. So if you wonder why someone would be talking about pesticide use on a golf course or in urban areas, there's an enormous amount of pesticide used in those areas. Now, is all of it on lawns? Probably not. I would say a lot of this could be and is probably related in urban areas to structural pest control. I don't want to say all of this is getting blanketed on turf and golf courses, but for sure, pesticides are a part of our lives, which is very disconnected from the way I think many of our citizens view pesticides. Well, they don't use pesticides, but they don't look under the counter and see the Raid and the tick material on their dogs, which is the same grub control we use for lawns. There's an enormous disconnect. Where the stuff ends up tends to be a big problem, and so my approach to this has always been pollution prevention, right? If we're not using it, if we're not relying on it, the chance that the USGS is going to find it in a stream, and oddly enough, when you see some of their highest insecticide concentrations, they tend to be located, at least in the Northeast, in some of these heavily urbanized areas. Now, we're not immune to this from the nutrient perspective. This is the North and South Fork of Long Island, where they've done some recent nutrient use and testing well surveys, surface and groundwater well surveys, and have found that fertilizers on lawns and golf courses, because of the high percentage of golf courses and lawns in these affluent areas, there's a fair amount of materials used, and there have been legislative initiatives in these areas to further restrict the use of these nutrients. So we've been challenged as scientists to be able to say, well, how can you justify this use? So my colleague and retired colleague, Marty Petrovic, spent a lot of his career working on this particular issue. But the pesticide issue continues to, the restriction of pesticide use continues to gather momentum in Tony's native land of Canada, one of your native lands of Canada. They really led the charge in banning pesticide use in urban environments, primarily on lawns. But in Montgomery County, where this recent legislation was promulgated and about to be passed, it was going to impact golf courses as well, especially municipal golf courses. One of the things that people don't realize is a lot of municipalities, including the state of New York, manage golf as a recreational landscape. And so they provide opportunities for laws to be passed that don't have to be voted on by the citizens. If the governor signs an executive order, that's the way the parks get managed. That's the way the municipalities get managed. So what's happening is they're trying to get some of these executive orders at least on public land. Now Montgomery County went a little bit further and said, we want to ban it on private land as well. Now you start running into the private-public land issues that we face in our country. Canada has gone one step further. It's been the PMRA has been a very activist organization since the new prime minister came into power, that handsome-looking guy you got up there. And so chlorothalonil, a very commonly used contact fungicide, is going under significant restrictions. Iprodione, thiophanate methyl, chlorpyrifos, all of these commonly used turf pesticides are probably going to be completely removed from the market in the next 5 to 7 years in Canada, which I think doesn't bode well for people who want to sell chemicals in the United States, because I think that that is exactly the way we are going to be going. I've been saying it for the better part of 25 years of my academic career, so maybe by the time I retire, much of what I've been barking about might actually come true. So how do you deal with the public that when you ask them about environmental issues, how do they respond? So this is a couple of Gallup surveys I wanted to make you aware of. Percentage of Americans worrying a great deal about certain environmental problems. And two of the ones that I work very closely with, drinking water and contamination of soil and water, not necessarily by toxic waste, but pollution of rivers as well. You can see for the people who worry about environmental issues, which is about half of the American population, a full half of them are very much worried about the things that our work focuses on. You know, how do we keep these inputs out of those water bodies? Now, the fascinating thing about the way people view the environment is when the economy's not doing well over the last 2 decades, since we've started to see more significant financial crises, and you can track the financial crises on this graph. This is a simple question that says, if push comes to shove, should we favor economic issues over environmental issues, or should we face environmental issues over economic issues? And for many, many years, up until the turn of the century, they said, wait a minute, protection of the environment should be given priority over everything, right? Now you'd think, well, we're experiencing this big environmental movement, but I think what you see is a steady decline in people interested in environmental quality, certainly at the level that they're interested in the quality of their economic life. So this creates a number of challenges when you're constantly talking to people about environmental issues, whether they're going to be interested in what you're saying, whether there is a driver to motivate them to change their behavior by using less products. And I think a lot of that goes back to the sort of socioeconomic stuff that Jenny was talking about in our faculty meeting this morning, and this graph really depicts that. So, you know, as an extension scientist, it's sort of nice to learn new things, but as I learn new things, I want to see how I can help change people's behavior by taking that science and putting it to work, and that's really the stage I'm trying to set moving forward. So here's the issue. This is the issue. I was on faculty a couple of years when this happened. Spitzer signs an executive order banning pesticide use on state park land. So in 1998, he comes in for the 5 minutes he was governor and really sort of went through and in his normal way sort of slashed and burned everything and took a real activist agenda and banned pesticide use on state park land. And at the same time, so did Suffolk County Parks. Now, what I thought was interesting was, what about the 27 New York State Office of Park, Recreation, and Historical Preservation courses? That's what that long acronym stands for. What about those courses? And what about the 3 courses on Long Island? And I think they just, oh, these are state parks. We don't need pesticides on state parks. So state parks don't use Roundup anymore. They don't use any synthetic chemical pesticides that when there's not a golf course associated with it. So Jennifer Grant, who many of you know, Dr. Jennifer Grant is the director of the New York State IPM program. We've been colleagues since really, I knew her even when I was a graduate student here in the late 1980s when she was beginning her work with Rod Ferrantino in IPM. And Jennifer came and said, look what's happening. Can we have golf courses without pesticides? I said, no, you can't have a golf course without pesticides. And she said, how do you know? And that's how dead silent the conversation went after that. no one's ever tested trying to manage a golf course without pesticides. People say organic, otherwise I can promise you they're using regular chemical pesticides. And these executive orders said anything with an EPA number can't be used. That was the executive order that was signed when we first started this work. So she said, how do you know? And so then it was writing proposals and the normal process we go through. And the question was simply, at first we pitched the idea to do it on our research plots, because as a practical golf course guy, I said, who's going to let us kill grass on their golf course? Because I was fairly sure that was what was going to happen. Ecologically, if you are maintaining a golf course for 70 years with pesticides and all of a sudden you stop spraying those pesticides, what kind of chance you think ecologically those plants have that have been held up all these years by preventing diseases and preventing insect problems? The chances of them working are very less. So I blame Jennifer for me being here today, and of course my relationship with her has been one of the great joys of my career. I had been fortunate to start working with the Bethpage Park guys in the center of Long Island, training them because it was announced back in 1997 that they were going to have the 2002 US Open, which was the biggest golf tournament in the world, and they didn't have a staff that even knew the first thing about how they might prepare a golf course for that. They were state park workers, and this golf course, which is one of the great ones in the world, was left into decline. Its demise and decline was well known. There just wasn't money to keep it up. The leaders of golf wanted to sort of reinstill public golf, so this was the first time the US Open was held on a truly public golf course, the kind of golf course you sleep in your car to be able to play first thing in the morning. And so I had this long relationship with them, and I literally will tell you, I leveraged it. I said to the park superintendent, Dave Catalano at the time, I said, hey man, you have 5 golf courses here. We need one of them to test this out. And he said, absolutely, that's what we should be doing. It almost gets me choked up every time I say it, because if he said no, I'm not sure what I would have done. So he gave us a golf course and he basically said, yeah, do what you got to do. So 2002, Bethpage was a great place to do it because the world was looking at Bethpage, right? The world had their eyes on this golf course that hadn't been on television ever, hadn't ever hosted a major tournament, and it had to be sort of pulled off in a 5-year period. And as you see, it was enormously successful. Even got to work with my nephew, who was on the grounds crew. So one of the things you do as an extension scientist in my world is when there's work to be done and there's a chance to get up and do it, it's a way you build relationships with your peers as say, hey, well, he's not just a guy who locks himself up in those rooms. He's out there actually, boy, he knows how to run a greens mower. He knows how to do this. He knows how to do that. And I do, because before I came back to graduate school, I was a golf course superintendent. But I want to say how much of a benefit this is in changing people's behavior. I think one of the great challenges environmental groups have in general is they're trying to change systems many times from the complete outside. And I don't know how else to say it, I'm a mole. I'm this guy who's been in the turf business for 30-something years and have consistently tried to make changes in this environmental way. And I finally, after 25 years, I feel like some of that work is coming to fruition. So this is what work is like during a US Open when it rains a lot. That's me. You wouldn't believe they actually try to play golf in this thing. They even wrote a book about the tournament. Mentioned a couple of times in this book. It was the first time, again, the big tournament was played on a public stage. All right, Bethpage is a busy place. People love playing golf. They'll play between 50 and 60,000 18-hole rounds a year on the green course that we play on. And it's not uncommon that when you play at the golf course here, this is one of the putting greens. So here's a group putting their ball in. This group here finished putting and is waiting for these guys to tee off, who are teeing off while there's people on the green. It's a par 3, so they're hitting to the green, while people on the par 3 are standing back waiting for them to hit up. That's what this is like. It is a constant play, traffic, and all that foot traffic creates a lot of challenges for living things, of which grass plants are mowed at about 1/10 of an inch when they're experiencing that traffic. So what is the Bethpage State Park? It's 5 golf courses, 1,500 acres, 260,000 rounds across the 5 golf courses, only 35,000 on the championship course. It's second only to the parking lot at Niagara Falls in income for the state park system. Nothing makes more money than the parking lot at Niagara Falls, and Bethpage is typically a close second to it. Our work is being done on the green course. We didn't necessarily think about that at the time, but the green course that was the original golf course that was on the land when Robert Moses bought is a loose term for Robert Moses. He sort of said, I want it, and next thing you know, he had it. And so then they built out the golf course to include 5 other properties as well. So our work was on the green course. Now I want to just set the stage for the first part of the study, because the meat of it is actually the second part of the work that we've been doing in the last 7 years. So for the first 10 years, 13 years, we were conducting an experiment that was a systems-based trial. And I guess the easiest way to explain it is, when you go on a diet as a person, sometimes nowadays there actually are prescribed foods, but generally you can eat lots of different things. Weight Watchers has a point system. You get these many points for this food. And so they don't tell you exactly what to eat all the time, but they say, here's what that stuff has to be like. That's how I would describe the way we approached the work. We had 18 putting surfaces, which is where we wanted to do this work. We put 9 of them under, what you're normally doing on the golf course, and 9 of them under what we thought would be practices that reduce overall stress on the plants and maximize their ability to withstand pest pressure. Right? If they're under less stress, theoretically they'll be less exposed, less vulnerable to particularly fungal diseases. Fungal pathogens, insect predation are the 2 big pest problems on these playing surfaces. So we had 9 the way they were doing it, and 9 the way we thought they should do it in the future. And then within those 9 surfaces, we replicated 3 pest management approaches. One that they normally used, one that we would call a sort of a progressive IPM approach, and one that initially was following the executive order, no chemicals with an EPA number. Then, I'll show you in a minute why we had to adapt that particular treatment to ultimately become what we published as bio-based pest management. Biologicals, reduced risk products that the EPA indicates as such. And so we published a paper in our International Turfgrass Research Journal back in 2009 that summarized our first 7 years of work. And I don't expect you to pay attention to the suite of practices. I just want you to see that these were what the cultural management systems look like. When I say cultural management, it's how you mow, how you fertilize, how you water. These are enormously intensive management systems. Enormous amounts of intervention on a daily basis. This isn't a put the apple tree and see it in 30 years kind of thing. This is every day they're at it, doing something to these playing surfaces in a variety of different ways to condition them to perform the way they're supposed to. So what we often call the most dysfunctional building in the entire state of New York, that's the State House. So the goals of our original project, as we set it out, was to first, if you ban pesticides, what are these growers going to do? They don't have, no one's ever sort of said, how do you do this with one hand tied behind your back? Those questions had never really been asked before, so we said, wait a minute, we need to figure out what sorts of things work, and give policymakers an opportunity to see the work. We would invite them out on a regular basis during the study to say, hey, here's the treatment that the law you are about to impose, this is going to be what happens when everybody starts managing like this. And so this is the funeral service for the second putting surface on the green course. It didn't take long for this to happen. The first 2 years we made it to July 1 year and early August another year, and then basically within a week that's what happens, and they die from the most commonly found fungal pathogen that no one ever worries about. The disease that actually came in and killed these surfaces is one that no one, even if you ask people what are the top 10 problems, they barely make that top 10 list. It's so common that they just spray all the time for it and never think about it. And all of a sudden, when you don't have the tools that solve common problems and you don't have alternatives to those problems, alternatives to solve those issues, it becomes very difficult to not have surfaces like this. These were putting surfaces that had been managed with chemicals in various ways, shapes, or form all the way back to chlordane in the 30s. These greens had never seen, these putting surfaces had never seen a growing season without regular pesticide use. So when we stopped doing it 2 years in a row, this is what happened. That's why the final treatment, that bio-based, the bio-based pest management here at the bottom had to be implemented, because Dave Catalano looked at us and said, do you have to keep killing these greens? Are you learning something? If you're learning something by continuing to kill them, by all means continue to kill them, but if you're not learning anything, maybe you can stop. And we did one more thing before we stopped, and that's we invited the policymakers out there. The Suffolk County legislators, we probably had 4 there, and we had 2 state senators and their aides there for a twilight field day with about 15, 20 people, and we said, this is what happens when your law gets enacted. And their comment was, oh. I think that there is this, and maybe you see this in agriculture as well, there's this pervasive attitude, well, what do you need pesticides for? How hard could it be? What do you need pesticides for? And, oh, it's a golf course. Why are you using them on a golf course? So the idea that we would take away a tool and it would result in something like this, I think speaks to the level of ignorance that we have in much of our legislatures when it comes to these kinds of complicated issues. So our operating principles with the project was, number 1, establish cultural practices that reduce stress, create an environment that has less problems. And then when you're going to intervene with a product, right? I can tell you every snake oil salesman in the country found out we were doing this and said, hey, we got the magic potion for you, Frank. And we had to immediately say, wait a minute, who says that? And they said, well, you know, we tried it in a greenhouse one weekend on cucumber and it worked really good. So that's the kind of stuff that we were confronted with when we started this work, 15 years ago. So challenges of new technology. I will say, God bless those people at Bethpage for putting up with, if I had 10 ideas, one of them might have been a good one, but they let me try all 10 of them. And we tried brewery waste compost for snow mold. We had to push the snow off and put the brewery waste down because there was data that said that would work. And lo and behold, we didn't have snow mold, but we had the worst case of fairy ring you've ever seen. This whole idea, I read a paper recently that increasing Pseudomonads has led to more take-all patch problems in wheat. A Galliminomyces species problem goes up when you increase microbial activity of a particular microbe. So I think we have a lot to learn about these sorts of things, and this drove many of the golf course guys crazy this one year. We have gone to pharmaceutical grade microbial fermenters, put these bugs in, put the microbes in there, brew a slurry, put it in a spray tank, and spray it every day for 150 days. So we did that, and it was okay. I mean, it certainly reduced some of the pest problems. It was a microorganism, and for a while they were injecting this stuff into the irrigation system, but it just wasn't practical. We did the carbon footprint. It would have been better to bring 100 more pounds of pesticide into the operation than use this thing. We've tried direct injection sprayers. Andrew Landers, when he first came to campus, worked with us on this. It's a pure tank of water with jockey tanks that will allow you in real time to adjust rates and locations and a two full boom setup. This was a state-of-the-art prototype. Once we had an intern that used it, once that kid left, everybody looked at it and said, I'm not sitting on that thing. And agriculture's been doing this for a really long time, and now it's finally starting to come back to the golf industry. GPS-controlled sprayers, variable rate technology. I was 15 years ahead of my time. We had this on the golf course 15 years ago, and we couldn't even get them to take a look at it. One student did it one year, and we could never get it going again. Compost teas, this was a big deal with the organic movement on Long Island. We have a lot of people with a lot of time on their hands that really believe organic is the solution to every problem known to man, and if we just use more compost, the world would be better. So we did the research in Ithaca and found, and then we actually did it on Long Island as well to appease some of these real critical people. So they didn't think we were doing anything useful because it wasn't organic. Direct injectors on the side of the irrigation system. We did this actually at the Cornell golf course as well. Products that you find, there's billions of dollars spent on products that have no practical value for use in turf. No matter what we say, we can't stop them from using them, but they continue to do it. So just to give you a sense of the golf course, that we're talking about fairly small putting surfaces, about 4,500 square feet, and they get a fair amount of traffic. I show you this graph. This was a 7-year track of the rounds of golf. This is what happened after the first 2 years of killing the greens. So this is when we started, and then the greens died and they didn't come back, and then the greens died and they didn't come back. And so once the state revenue people said, whoa, we're making less money on this. Maybe there is something to this golf course thing that we should pay attention to. And so we made some adjustments to our systems that allowed us that bio-based pest management, and we saw a return in rounds of golf. And when I show this to people who manage golf courses as small businesses, like many small farmers, they're like, oh, yeah, when our greens aren't in good shape, people don't like playing here, or they want a discount. And let me tell you how rude Long Island public golfers can be sometimes. When they find they can't play a putting green because it's dead, they want a discount on the round. So anyway, speaking of the golfers, we did interview them regularly. This was Jennifer's part of the project, dealing with the golfers. And so we would survey them and ask them if percentage of golfers that said they wanted you to keep quality high, use pesticides whenever they might help, keep reasonably good, use pesticides judiciously, minimize pesticide use regardless of quality, and don't use pesticides. Now what you see in this graph that's fascinating is, particularly in the early parts of the study, we didn't survey them when the greens were dead necessarily, but a lot of these golfers went through this experience. You can see an occasional increase, and when we started looking at this data further, it did track economy. The better the economy was and the more they liked playing golf, the less they cared about pesticide use. And golfers in general don't care much about pesticide use in general. They have sort of grown accustomed to it, like people who live in agrarian societies and see farmers apply pesticides all the time. They don't see it as something abnormal that people do. But on golf courses, you know, where people don't normally see other people applying pesticides, people who are not golfers get all worked up about it. We find that the golfers tend not to get that worked up about it. Okay, so how would you rate the overall condition of the green course in 2008? And so we had about a 60% very good and 28% adequate. So we're going to say, tough New York public golf crowd, we've satisfied about 85%, 90% of the public. And we're driving down pesticide use in this project. So we surveyed the golfers, and we asked them about how they thought it looked and how they thought it played. So green quality rating by golfers, looking at our IPM with alternative cultural practices, all of them thought those greens were good and equal to, statistically, the same as the way they've been doing business. So we've developed this alternative collection of practices that the golfers say is doing pretty good and consistent with the way they've been doing business in the past. So if we can make our adjustments to their management good for the environment and transparent to the golfer, that's the sweet spot that I think we were shooting for when we started this work. And playing surfaces as well. I can skip over some of that. We monitored labor hours because one of the knocks on alternative or organic is it takes more time, it's more labor intensive, and we did not necessarily find that. Now the AC is alternative culture IPM, and the green bar is the standard practice, the blue bar is the progressive practices that we've implemented. And you could see early on, when we first started implementing them, it took more time, right? Changing the way they manage, you'd expect things to take more time. But as we've gone along, we saw that, oh, they got used to this different way of management, and then it no longer took more time than the conventional approach. Now, fundamentally, the title of my talk is Pesticide Use Reduction, so let me talk to you about the way we look about pesticide use. Obviously, practitioners pick them based on multiple factors. Jennifer likes efficacy, economics, and the environment. I think it's an easy way to summarize the way people select pesticides. We have Cornell guidelines that guides them. But our approach with, at Bethpage and then with our larger state park group has been, first of all, New York state labeled chemicals. It's got to be labeled for use in New York. That's the use of the guidelines. We want it to be effective, and I'll show you how we went about that. And we wanted to introduce some sort of environmental screening that said, okay, here's 10 pesticides. They're different chemically. They're different based on their potential environmental impact. We want you to screen the products you use based on this screening model known to many as the environmental impact quotient. So before I get to a discussion of the EIQ, I want to give you a sense. There's an enormous amount of data available looking at efficacy of products. Land-grant institutions have no problem spraying plots, have no problem telling you what works and doesn't work, and they do such a good job of it, I don't have to do it. We don't have to do it. And I can use that information and translate it here. And Paul Vincelli, a proud Cornell grad at Kentucky, publishes a particular bulletin every year that ranks efficacy, looks at fungicide and nematicide tests and says, these do pretty well in a lot of different studies. These do poorly in a lot of different studies. These do good in some, not good in others. And so he ranks the efficacy of the various products. So we've put this into a tool to help the managers make decisions. Now, the EIQ is one you may be aware of. Joe Kovacs, a former fruit IPM specialist, developed this model many years ago to see if he could compare organic apple production to IPM apple production to conventional apple production. That was the original intent of this model that he began to run chemicals through to demonstrate one pest management system versus another. This model is heavily scrutinized by the scientific community. One person published a paper said it's no better than random numbers. Now, I will say there are some caveats to this. When the model was originally developed, there was a lot of products that were really bad we were using. And I think one of the things that's affected its efficacy as a model of screening is a lot of those products are gone. So the wide disparity in potential environmental impact of a lot of products is more related to their overall amounts than necessarily their inherent toxicity. So this model that Joe developed, Jennifer and I sat down and said, hey, we should give these guys a tool at Bethpage to screen these things. We adapted this a little bit for our use and then began to have them use it. So this was a table that a turf manager would get at Bethpage for dollar spot control, a Sclerotinia minor, that common disease that killed those greens. Here's a variety of products that we know have decent efficacy. The Frack Code, for those of you that aren't familiar with these action codes, there's a HRAC code, an IRAC code. This is the Frack Code, Fungicide Resistant Action Committee, that basically codes them based on their mode of action. We wanted to stop using a particular contact fungicide called chlorothalonil, and a lot of the concern was, oh, we're going to get resistance to these other chemicals. I said, well, you're going to get resistance if all you do is spray one particular type of chemical. But if you use a variety of modes of action, you're more likely to hold off resistance. Resistance management continues to be and is an emerging issue in our field as well. So this is what they'd have and the subsequent EIQ numbers that go along with it. We encourage them to use reduced risk products. We encourage them, when efficacy was there, to use OMRI-listed products, and we've used a few. And then we looked at the EIQ of the various management systems. So I don't expect you to grab all this, but essentially what I want you to do is compare this one to this one. This is conventional culture, conventional pest management. And what you see here is what we were learning in these other pest management programs, these bio-based ones. Treatment integrity was compromised a little bit, and they started using them in their conventional treatment. So we were not the best research result, but a really good behavioral change. Like, wow, this product works as good as that product. This one's better for the environment. I'll use that product. My sense is if you give growers options that they can afford and that work, most likely they're going to use those approaches if it's not a big shift in their system. So we've seen real, this is the one I want you to compare to, not this one. Alternative culture and IPM versus conventional culture and conventional pest management. And so you see the real low EIQ, which is indicating the environmental impact is significantly reduced. So another way of looking at the same data, which culminated in a publication that Bob Portman, who we lost unexpectedly this past March, we were sorry to lose Bob. We didn't just lose him from here. Bob passed away suddenly, so it was a big shock to our program. But this was his master's work and a longtime colleague with mine. So once we got that data, we hired Bob and we said, hey, we learned this stuff on the green course. How about we take it to the whole state park system? Applied the same thinking and started to look at our EIQ for our pest management programs and compare them to different golf courses. We were collecting pest management programs, pesticide use records from around the country, comparing what some golf courses are doing compared to what our flagship golf course, the tournament golf course, was doing, and the average state golf courses were doing. So first of all, we were starting to establish a baseline. Now the University of Wisconsin has taken this and they're creating a statewide initiative of all their golf courses to be at or below an average EIQ value. But one of the things you notice, these are various parts of the golf course, small area. So this represents about 3 acres. This is about 4 acres. Fairways generally can be 20 to 30 acres of turf. Rough areas 40 to 60 acres. So the more you apply pesticides to larger areas, the larger your EIQ goes up. And I've been still comfortable using the EIQ because while it's a measure of toxicity of the material, risk is a function of toxicity and exposure. So we're looking at the toxicity of the product and the exposure that a golfer or the citizens might have by deploying these compounds on a large area. So when we looked, so now you're looking at 7 years, 6 years of data we've collected from 15 state park golf courses that have been participating in the expanded program since 2009, 2010. And this is the total environmental impact of their pesticide use over that period of time. So you can see when we started the program, this was the year before we started the program, we said, hey, use this list, spray less compound, use EIQ, and boom, right away, we saw big reductions. Now I break this out into all the golf courses, all 15 courses, only the 5 or 6 on Long Island, no, 7 on Long Island, and then 8 upstate. So 7 and 8 golf courses, so roughly the same number of golf courses, but you see the majority of pesticide use is occurring on Long Island golf courses, right? On Long Island golf courses. So they immediately began to drop their EIQ, and they got pest problems like crazy. Once we started to take this out to a broader audience, they were going through the same thing we went through when we started 15 years ago. Now what I think we've seen is sort of a return. We watched a big increase for a couple of years, and Jennifer Grant and I worked very closely on training and trying to figure this out. And so in the last few years, we've implemented a strategy that I want to leave you with as I wrap up what we've learned in these last few years about really changing pest management behavior using this data. So what this data allows us to do, and what Bob really left us, this great gift, is this enormous database that allows us to look at their behavior based on environmental impact of the products that they used. So we took the field use EIQ, which is the toxicity of the material calibrated for the rate, multiplied by the area treated. So you see that a majority of increases across, this is all 15 golf courses, came from large increases to rough areas. Weed control, it was the primary product that's driving a lot of this, as well as additional fungicide treatments that are getting made, because once people see a really good golf course, they want to keep playing on a really good golf course. Once you give them a perfect apple, they want a perfect apple all the time. So we sort of were a victim of our own success that we got good at it, and we watched their behavior. So we said, wait a minute, we're going to start to stop this. So we started to make some changes there. You also see fairway use, which was high, as has gotten bigger. And putting green use has stayed fairly flat. This is where it got very interesting and where we've really implemented the education. First of all, we want you to stop we told the guys, we want you to stop using products that are very high toxicity. And it represented in 2015 about 50% of the products they were still using we would call bad actors or EIQs above a value that we liked. You're starting to see a decline in their use, but boy, that use went up quite a bit, even above where we started. This is where the education's been focused most recently, and that is 2 pest problems on these golf courses that about 50%, 48% of all the pesticide used on these 15 golf courses went at these 2 pests. And that's what this EIQ data allowed us to see. So again, knowing this, we tried to implement some training, which included the use of predictive models, skip B over this, the use of predictive models that was saying that we've been working with Art DiGaetano at the Northeast Climate Center. We had these predictive models available for the last decade. So we started using these models a long time ago and developed risks that could predict when this disease would be a particular problem, and we asked the practitioners to monitor that data. So here you have these dots in low, medium, and high risk put out in indices. So here is, below this is low risk, medium risk for disease, high risk for disease, and this is the trace of the risk that was experienced at Bethpage in 2014. And you can see there was about a 12 to 14 day period when risks were very high. That's when we want to reserve those high risk control products for only those times and use softer products or products with lower EIQ values during periods of lower risk if they're needed at all. So we began this in 2014, gave them some suggestions for looking at a model what would happen, and then actually looked at their chemical applications during that period of time and found when you look at their EIQ values, that one I don't know what happened there, but when you look at some of their highest EIQ values, they're following when some of the pressures were the highest. So we're starting to see that by bringing a lot of different ways of thinking about pest management to bear for these people, they're starting to adjust their management to be more in line with when the risk occurs, how to use these lower EIQ products, and how the result in the end is going to be less environmental risk associated with pesticide use. Andy Wilson is our project manager and deserves all the credit in the world for putting up with me all these years of visiting. I would spend I was down on Long Island from April to November every other week for the better part of 7 years, and he put up with me. This was at the most recent Barclays tournament. We've shifted some of our work to enhance pollinator habitat. The project continues to expand. We get $100,000 every year from state parks, and we've started to plant some of these out-of-way areas now into places where pollinators have some more help. And of course, our most recent extension accomplishment was publishing this New York State Best Management Practices for Golf Courses. This is primarily for water quality protection. And the EIQ and the things that we've learned from our project are embedded in this. So with that, I'm right at my time. Sorry for that. Wish I had time for questions.
All right, let's make Frank. Maybe take 1 or 2 quick questions.
Janice.
So I have two questions on approaches that did you consider or do, and one was trichoderma. And then the other is, are there known suppressive soils to the fungal diseases you're interested in, and could you use like a microbiome transplant type of an approach to try to enhance control of this?
So the answer to the first question, did we use trichoderma? The answer is yes, and we continue to use the trichoderma product down there. It's worked very well on a number of root pathogen problems that we've had. As far as suppressive soils, No such luck there, Janice. I think Eric Nelson early on in his career was working on that particular area. I think we found some things with Pythium that might be useful, but I don't think anybody's taken that work any further. I know that's something that the microbiome is things Jenny's working on, and there may be future for that sort of stuff. But we haven't found any suppressive soils that we can characterize that exist currently.
One more question, anybody? Last question? All right, if not, let's thank Frank, everyone.
This has been a production of Cornell University, on the web at cornell.edu.